Hello, Joe. Very nice. Congratulations. I really enjoyed this this masterclass. I especially like it because it's technical and very practical. And I have to say that I felt emotional when I saw gallery teachers on Spotify. I thought being on Spotify would be something really difficult to achieve, and actually you did it in such a natural and easy way that I'm astonished. We have to do something now. Now that we are on Spotify, we have to do something.
Fantastic. So, well, thank you for your kind words. I mean, to try and to remember everything and do it in the right order. I'm sure you saw there. I made a couple of mistakes in when you're recording, when you're trying to think to say something sensible. But then I tried to be very natural and just say, okay, I'm going to do take two. Normally take two. The second take is normally better because you sound more confident. And then at the end as well, watching back now, I can think, okay, so I should have gone there straight away. I should have done this. But yeah, I think to remember everything in 50 minutes is a challenge. But I'm really delighted that you found it useful. And I think that showing people the practical step-by-step of making a podcast should, as you say, make them less fearful of the process to show how easy it is to create content, to publish it on Spotify that can be accessed on any device. I really hope that it encourages people to start podcasting, because that's what this is all about.
And actually, a very interesting topic that you brought up, mistakes. So what do you think about making mistakes? Is it possible to avoid mistakes, or
it's not possible to avoid mistakes? It depends. The big issue with that is it's a really important question. The big issue with that is how much of a perfectionist are you? Because if you are the sort of person that wants to remove every single mistake, that's fine, but you have to take into account the fact that will take a lot longer in the whole sort of when we're talking about the takes you're going to make and then the editing then you have to do as a result of that. I would suggest, and I know it's easy for me to say this, but I would suggest to try and maybe try not to make too many mistakes, because it will take time in the editing. If you're quick with editing, then that's not so bad. But I think that the students will probably be very au fait with you being, authentic or listening to authentic audio. So people do make mistakes. As long as it's not like a howler, then I think it's so fine. I think it's fine. That said, personally, I'm a huge perfectionist. I will spend the time editing my own podcast in trying to edit out as much as I possibly can. But what I normally do, I mean, obviously we've looked at Anchor today, but what I normally do is I normally will do all my editing in Audacity, which, if people don't know, is a free open source a DAW, which stands for Digital Audio Workstation, which works on Windows and on Mac. And I normally do all my editing there, and then could then use Anchor to publish my podcast as the final step. But if you want to edit in Anchor, as you could see in the video, I showed how you can sort of top and tail the recording, so you can remove the bit at the beginning, the bit at the end. You can remove the bits in the middle as well, but then if you do that, you then have to save all the segments separately, and then it can get a bit unwieldy. So personally, if you're looking for quick and easy editing in Anchor, I would suggest just going for the top and tail option. If you want to go into more detail about editing, I would install Audacity, and there are lots and lots of YouTube clips on how to edit with Audacity. If you wanted to go down that route, there's only so much one can do in 50 minutes. So that would be my answer.
Yeah. Very interesting. By the way, we have some reflective questions, and then we have quite a number of questions from our members. So I don't know if we will have time to read all of the questions. Let's start with the reflective questions, and then we move on. First one, why is podcasting a good idea in EFL classroom?
Okay, so that's again a great question. I think, as I was saying in the video, I think based on my own experience, I think that the reason podcasting is so good in a languages classroom, in the EFL classroom, is the fact that you, from the point of view of the creation process, it's all about encouraging the students to write their own scripts, to think about the content carefully. So they're going to produce something which is unique, which is they're going to produce a multimedia outcome. It's going to really, that's going to hopefully motivate them. The fact they know they're publishing to a real audience, the fact that they're going to be recording their voice, they're going to have to be saying whatever it is they want to say again and again and again to make sure it's as good as it possibly can be, which can really, really help them with their pronunciation. It can really help them to embed the content they're covering. In the examples I was talking about when I was doing grammar podcasts, that was certainly the case. The children who had written their scripts were able to really deepen their understanding of what the grammar point was that they were talking about through the whole process of creating the podcast. So I think from the point of view of giving the students more ownership of their work and publishing, I think that's incredibly powerful. But just in relation to oracy, I think the recording and editing process really helps them with their listening and speaking skills. And that's why I think in languages, I think that podcasting is a brilliant fit. And that's why I've tried to make it as simple as possible to encourage people to get started.
Yes, I noticed in my experience also that sometimes students are need to stay in a passive role. So with podcasting is more active. They have to achieve something, and I think they can find results straight away, and it's a lot more. It's very interesting for them instead of just learning a language in a classical way. Second reflected question: is it possible to podcast completely for free? Well,
it is. That wasn't the case necessarily a few years ago, but now that we have a website like anchor.fm, which is the whole solution is completely free. So the recording, the editing, and most importantly, the hosting is completely for free. So there are other hosts which you can also use, like Podbean, for example. I one of my podcasts is on Podbean, but for that one you have to pay like £10 a month for a basic allowance, which is fine if that's what you want to do. But lots of teachers, in my experience, only want to do things if they're free to do with technology. So if you're using anchor.fm, the whole process is completely free. And as I mentioned, what some people like to do if they're more experienced with audio editing is create the podcast using, say, Audacity, and then publish the results to Anchor as the host. So you can do it completely for free now. And the fact that Spotify acquired Anchor back in 2019 would suggest, as I said in the video, that it's not going to suddenly go away and disappear, because there have been hosts in the past that have been free that haven't been able to cope with all the people around the world who want to then suddenly make podcasts. And so as a result of that, they've had to then shut down their servers. But with Anchor, with Spotify, well, it's basically Spotify now, because as I say, Spotify acquired Anchor 3 years ago. It means now that it's very, very unlikely that's going to happen, because what Spotify have done in recent years is they've pumped millions and millions and millions of dollars into podcasting. So it's a perfect time to get started now, I think.
And good. And last question, last reflective question: how long should my podcast episode be?
Yeah,
I think this is very well. You go first, and then.
Okay. Well, this is a classic question which comes up all the time on different podcasting Facebook groups, etc., that I'm on, and the answer really is, how long is a piece of string? So it depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. It might be that you only want to produce, let's say, 5-minute podcasts, which is fine. It's absolutely fine if you want to do that. If you want to produce ones which are 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour, in relation to, and also you need to think of your listeners, your audience. So let's say if you in education, if you're producing, let's say you're producing a podcast for teachers, it might be an idea to think about doing a 20-minute podcast, which could be a really nice opportunity to listen on your commute, or a 30-minute podcast, that sort of thing. So a lot of people consume their podcasts when they're commuting to and from work, or maybe when they're at the gym and they're listening to a podcast then, or they're going for a walk, listening to a podcast, or whenever they've got a bit of dead time, let's say. So maybe say 20 minutes or 30 minutes could be a nice time. That said, if you're doing an interview with somebody, then I personally think 45 minutes to an hour is fantastic for a podcast, because as opposed to, say, a radio show, you get the opportunity to really do a much deeper dive into, you know, asking the questions you've always wanted to ask to somebody. You can have a proper conversation. That idea of authenticity is so important with podcasts, and that's why I think a lot of people like podcasts, because of the fact that in the era of fake news, it's something which comes across as authentic, which I think is incredibly powerful. So that question is a great question, because it just depends. It depends, you know, it depends on your audience, what your audience wants. I would really encourage you to ask your audience what content would you like, how long would you like the episodes to be. Obviously, you can make a decision yourself about that and just go for it. But if you do ask your potential audience what they would like, then that's a great way of designing the podcast to meet their needs. That said, I think it's also a good idea just to go with your gut feeling on what you want to produce as content. And most importantly, thinking about a theme which has got legs. In other words, thinking about something which you think which will regularly motivate your listeners and keep them coming back for more, and that's something and also content which you're personally passionate about, because if you're passionate about content, it will come across in the audio and you'll get really good quality audio, I think, as a result of that. So the length of the podcast, it could be, let's say in a lesson context, it could be a 5-minute summary. So a little bit like the bullet points I was talking about in the video. Instead of reading from a script, you could have like a summary of the lessons. You don't want to, you know, re-record the whole lesson or record a lesson and publish that as a podcast. You want to just get the salient points of, say, you know, 5 minutes worth of the bullet points covering what it is that you've been talking about. That's what I would suggest. But if it's an interview, then you might want to go for something, you know, longer form, or you might want to cut it up into different sections. But as long as you're consistent with the format, so that people are familiar with what they expect with the format, but then the content changes in each section. I think that's also really important as well. So it could be any length.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And actually, I would like to point the attention of on this conversation about passion. You mentioned passion, and I agree with you. So if you are doing something because you think that you are going to be successful and you have to hit the nail, and you're not passionate, it will be very hard for you to produce any kind of content. So you need to follow what is important for you. In your case, and I think in my case as well, I like interviews, I like interviewing people, and it's something, even if we spend a lot of time doing this and the editing process, at least this is something that we enjoy. Otherwise, if you are not enjoying this, it's very painful. It can be very painful.
Yeah, and it will come across. It will come across in your voice. It will come across that you're not being passionate about something. And also, I think I'm sure we'll go on to how often should you podcast. If it becomes something which is onerous to you, let's say you start off with your podcast, you're incredibly keen, and you think, I'm going to do a podcast a week. It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to have it as a never-ending podcast. I'm just going to do episode after episode after episode. And then you find after, let's say, 10 episodes that actually things have come up, or you've been really busy, or it's become a bit of an onerous task to produce a podcast every week. Then that will come across. That can certainly come across, I think. So what I would suggest, based on my own experience, is that I would go for seasons instead of just a never-ending podcast. So you let the audience know that you're going to produce a podcast of, let's say, 10 episodes. You produce those 10 episodes. You could record all of them before you publish the first one, or maybe do a bit of batch processing at the beginning. Let's say you've recorded and edited 3 podcasts, and so you've got that in your back pocket, so you're not sort of worrying about, you know, that you've got to put a podcast out for the following week, as it were. You've got a couple stacked up ready to go, and then you make sure that you're regularly recording, and then you put them out in let's say 1 a week for 10 weeks. Or what you could do is you could go for, say, 1 a month, and then give yourself enough time to record in between time each time. So in podcasts I've done, I've tended to go for either 1 a month when I'm doing it as a rolling podcast, or I've recorded all the podcasts beforehand and then published them either all in one go or sequentially 1 a week. So it really depends. But if you're starting to think, oh, I've got to do another episode, and it becomes onerous, then that's no good, really. So I think that you shouldn't beat yourself over the head with making your podcast. It should always be something which is fun. So I think that the idea of having a season whereby you have an established number of episodes is a good idea, and then you can have a bit of a break, or just say, okay, we're going to start season 2 in a couple of months' time, and then it still becomes fun. I think that's a really, really important point.
I think it's a very good idea, I have to say, because usually I struggle between being organized and being able to improvise. So if you're too organized, you can't really improvise. But sometimes you find out that you start a project and then it doesn't go in the direction you planned, and you have to be ready to change. So I really like the idea of having different seasons. I think I will take it in consideration for
Cool.
my own activities. We have several questions from our members. By the way, if I selected a few questions. If you want to interact directly with Joe, just click the button, raise your hand, and we will unmute your microphone. Otherwise, I will continue with some of the questions that I selected. Some of them you already covered in your podcast, but I think it will be interesting to mention more about them. And actually, I have some questions on my own. I would start with a question from from my own. What's the difference between podcasting and radio?
Right, okay. So I sort of hinted a little bit about that earlier. I think for me, the big difference between podcasting and radio, although there is a bit of a blurred line. I think that back in, say, 2007, when the Guardian, for example, started to, or 2006 actually, with the Ricky Gervais podcast, they started to make podcasts and put them out there, and then the BBC at the time seemed to be not interested in making podcasts, and then a few years later, suddenly lots and lots of shows were available as podcasts, and that's all about that sort of critical mass of getting enough people interested in what podcasting was all about, and then having that that option of, or it becoming like a mainstream thing of having a podcast which goes alongside the radio show. So there's definitely blurring there, but I think from the point of view of like a DIY indie podcaster, what I really like about listening to indie podcasts, in other words, ones which have not been produced by radio station or company, is they can be a lot more engaging. They're authentic if you actually know the person who is the podcaster, who's interviewing people from all over the world, for example. That authenticity can really come across and can be something which is very engaging. And I think that if listeners like a podcast, they can become really, really loyal to that podcast. And it's a very intimate thing, isn't it? When you're listening to a podcast, you're listening to someone that you like, who you trust, and you like the sorts of the mannerisms that they have and their authenticity, then it becomes really something to look forward to. So I think, to me, that the authenticity of it is one of the main differences between a podcast and a radio show, which is not to say that people on radio are not authentic, but certainly one of the features which I really like about podcasting is the fact that if it's an independent podcaster that's creating it, you'll know they're doing it from a very authentic place. They're doing it because they love it. They love talking about the topic, whichever the topic might be, and they're doing it for the right reasons, as it were, because I'm sure we'll get on to monetizing podcasts, but lots of podcasters who are independent podcasters are just doing it for the passion of doing it, for the love of doing it. They're not being paid anything for it. They just enjoy connecting with other people, having conversations. I know some podcasts have talked about, I wanted to start a podcast, I just want to have an excuse to have a chat with this person I've admired for a long time. If I have a podcast, I can then record it. It's a win-win for them as well, because they like the fact that their ideas are being published to a real audience, and you get the opportunity to talk to, let's say, an edu hero that you might have, so they can then appear on your podcast. So I also think about, let's say, going back to length as well. With a radio show, you know exactly how long a particular program will be on the radio, because that's the format that's established. With a podcast, it can be anything you want. There are no rules basically with podcasting. You can find your own way. And I'd also really recommend for those people listening to this to not put on some sort of DJ voice because they're producing a podcast. Just be yourself. You don't have to say, "Hi everybody, we're listening to today's Joe Dale podcast," and all this, this sort of like manufactured DJ voice. Just be yourself, be your authentic voice. And if you're producing good content, which hopefully everyone would be, then you will find an audience for your content.
Thank you. I agree with you. And I would like to mention also that when you're producing a radio show, you have to focus on being successful. And with a podcast, you don't necessarily need to be successful. In other words, you don't need big numbers. You can make a podcast for a very small group, and you can be more intimate and talk to directly to people instead of just generally speaking for a broad audience. And I think this can make a very big difference. And I think this is one of the reasons why people say that radio and TVs are dying, while podcasts are, I have the impression that podcasts are flourishing at the moment. We are living a new era for podcasts. A couple of years ago, they seemed like old school, and actually more and more people are listening to podcasts right now. So you were talking about monetizing, and this is another very interesting topic. So let's say that we are teachers and we start our podcast. I don't think it's possible to go to a company and ask for a sponsorship. So unless you have big numbers. So any ideas on how can we make some money out of our podcast?
Okay, well, as I said already, I think the first thing to say is most indie podcasters don't make any money at all out of podcasting. They just do it because they love doing it. If you want to go down the monetizing route, then as you mentioned, you can get sponsorship, but you tend to have to have a really good handle on analytics. So say, for example, with Anchor, you do get access to analytics. I didn't talk about that in the video because obviously we didn't have any analytics. I was just showing you how to publish a podcast. But once you have published a few episodes, you can go in and you can have a look at your stats, and you can see how many downloads you've had, how many plays you've had, the countries where people have been listening to the podcast, that sort of thing, which is very exciting. And based on my own experience, because I have been able to get sponsorship for a couple of podcasts, which has been great. What the potential podcast sponsor wants to know is it's all about the analytics. So as much as you can give the potential sponsor about what the reach is that you have, either via your social media presence, your Twitter account, etc., or via the actual podcast itself. So what I've done personally is, before I've started the podcast, I've tried to get a sponsor for the podcast. But then with that, you then have to be very clear on what the content is that you want to produce and see whether that marries nicely with the audience that the company has. And if it does, then that's a win-win. And sometimes you are able to get like a sponsorship deal, which is fantastic. But I think that's quite rare, that said. So what most people do is they have, let's say they use a website like Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee or these sorts of things. And then at the end of their podcast, they would say something like, if you want to support the podcast, then feel free to make a contribution to my Patreon account. And that can be something which, if you have a loyal following, could be a way of generating income. I think that probably, unless you're huge, as it were, then the amount of income you would get from that probably wouldn't be that big. And I wouldn't suggest that thinking that you're going to make lots of money going into podcasting is necessarily a good idea. It really has to be about you being passionate about podcasting and passionate about the topic. In a way, when we're talking about Anchor and using it in the EFL classroom, we're not talking about monetization at all. We're talking about the learning benefits of creating a podcast, but to a simple way of being able to generate some sort of income, if that's what people want to do, then the Patreon, the Buy Me a Coffee route is something to consider. But it may be that you want to contact a potential sponsor and see if they're interested. But if you do that, then listen very carefully about what the questions are that they're asking you and try and find out the answers to those questions. For example, do you know, would you have information about how long each person has been listening for, or how many downloads there have been, or how many followers you have on Twitter, or or if you're going to publish the podcast onto YouTube, which is what some people do as well, how many subscribers do you have on your YouTube channel, and all these sorts of things. These are the sorts of bits of information that your potential sponsor will want to know. And then if you can persuade your sponsor to say yes, then normally what happens is you'll have like a mid-roll advert, whereby it might be, let's say, a minute-long advert that either they read out, or it's normally better if the podcaster reads out, which they include encouraging them to go to such a website to sign up, to use the resources. I find that running competitions and things like that is a good idea as well via the podcast. Anything that the sponsor is interested in, if they're willing to sponsor the podcast, then I would listen very carefully to what it is that they want to do. And if you're happy with that offer, then that would be a great thing. But as I've said, I wouldn't go into podcasting expect you're going to make a lot of money, because that's very difficult to do in my experience.
I would like to mention also that maybe it's not the right way to think. So starting a podcast because you want to earn money, because what I noticed that happens is you start with passion because you have a project in mind, and then as soon as you start thinking about the money, you focus on the money and not on the passion anymore, and the quality decreases. So I would say that to leave some time just to express yourself, and then if you start, also because you need the learning curve, you need to get better at this. So instead of focusing on having some money, just focusing on doing something that you like. And also when you feel you are ready for a sponsor, money is not the only thing. So in my experience, for example, I started a YouTube channel with my dog, and we had
right, okay.
We are right at the moment we have 200 subscribers, and we cut a deal with a company that produces food. So they sent us some food, and in our videos we mentioned them. So maybe this is something easier, and instead of just having money, you can have services and deals with the companies. And companies usually are more eager to cut a deal even when you are very small. And at the same time, you can start saying that you have a sponsor. So,
yeah, that's excellent. Well done. I'm impressed. That's very good. Yeah. I was going to say as well, another way of monetizing a podcast is if you know that someone is thinking of producing a podcast, or even you could contact a company saying, would you be interested in producing a podcast? And then you can then offer your services as a way of producing the whole thing. So you could not only do all the editing, but you could also publicize the podcast as well. But so that's not when you're necessarily deciding what the content's going to be. It might be that you contact a company and you ask them whether they'd be interested in having a set of interviews about their product, but then you're the person who's then going to produce that. So you're going to contact the people, you're going to set up the Zoom calls, etc. Which is away from what we're talking about here with Anchor. We just that's the sort of like more of a basic approach. But if you're going to go down the route of, for example, talking over Zoom, and then each person records their own audio on their own track, which could be, for example, using a nice microphone and going into Audacity, or recording on a mobile phone. So you're talking over Zoom, but you're actually recording your own voice individually as an individual track, and everyone's wearing headphones. You're not getting any what we call audio bleed, which is when you've got someone else's voice appearing on your audio, which is not what you want. And then everyone sends their track to the editor, and then you put all of those into your digital audio workstation. I use Audacity, so I'll then load up all the tracks and I'll line them all up based on the master audio in Zoom, which is the great way to do that. So then you're then producing someone else's podcast. But that's another way of generating income that I found as well with podcasting.
Very, very good. We don't have a lot of time left, and I have so many questions to ask you. So we have to be quick to answer a couple of them. So first of all, how do we promote our podcast? Let's say that we start with our podcast, and now we need audience. We need to build up an audience. Any advice on that particular area?
Okay. So first of all, I would start off local. So let everybody know in your local community, let's say in a school environment, put the URL of the podcast in the school newsletter, advertise it in your classroom, on posters, that sort of thing. If you have a social media presence, then put it out onto social media. The most important thing is to go where your audience is, or your potential audience is. So if you have a big following on, say, Instagram, then go to Instagram and put out little adverts about upcoming episodes. You could do an Instagram live if you wanted to, which you could then turn into a podcast. On Twitter, you could put out different tweets when you've got a new episode. You could ask an influencer, let's say, or someone who you know has got lots and lots of followers to tweet about an episode. You could ask an influencer if they want to appear on your podcast, because obviously they will then publicize the podcast once it's out there. But the most important piece of advice is to go where your audience is. So if you know that there are lots of people who like the sort of things that you like, who are on Twitter or Facebook groups or on Instagram, then go to those places. But it can be that you spread yourself too thin if you're not careful. So what I tend to do is I tend to use Twitter and Facebook, as in Facebook groups, and then tweeting on Twitter. So that's what I've done. But I think with anything, as I said earlier, if the content is good, then it will generate the audience. You just need to really raise awareness that the podcast is available and out there.
Good. And how do we find guests, especially free guests? So we don't have money to pay. So what do we do?
Well, in my experience, finding guests has not been an issue at all. It's been easy to find guests. What's harder is to explain to them what they need to do to produce a good quality bit of audio. So you might need to train them up on how to use the microphone correctly so you get good quality audio, or how to use a mobile phone. Let's say you put the mobile phone on a set of books, so it's just under their chin, so they're recording straight into the microphone on the phone, and then they then send you that track. Or with Anchor, you have what's called Record with Friends, which is only works on the app version, not on the web browser version. You can set up a recording with I think it's up to 15 people, if I remember correctly. But let's say you're just doing a one-to-one interview, you would set up the Record with Friends option on the iPad or the iPhone or an Android device. Send the link to the other person. You then connect together, a bit like Zoom, and you record your audio. But the quality of the audio will not be as good compared to if you make a local recording. But I mentioned some of the tools like Riverside and Squadcast, which do allow you to record local audio, but in other words, each person records their own audio. But I just find that the best solution, or the cheapest solution, is just to record into Audacity or onto a phone, and then everyone then sends the audio to the one person who then edits it all together.
By reading the questions from our members, I have the impression that most of them are thinking about doing podcasts about teaching English, because they are English teachers. What about not doing that? What about doing something completely different and using that topic to for the classes? So something that is not focusing on the grammar or the language, but just on something that they are passionate and they want to discuss with the students.
I think that's fine. I think, as I said earlier, with podcasting, there are no rules. So you can podcast about whatever you want, as long as you feel that the podcast theme has got legs. I would talk to the students about what they would be interested in, that you could maybe do a bit of research around it, or you could ask them to do a bit of research around the topics which you feel would be particularly relevant to them or engaging, or they would be willing to listen, every week or whatever it might be on a regular basis. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the content is, as long as the content's going to be engaging, professionally produced, and hits the mark, as it were. So I think that asking the audience what they would like first and foremost before you set out to make the podcast, because it does take a lot of time to make a really good podcast, I think, with the structure and I think different voices as well. I think having two voices on a podcast is much better than having one voice. You can obviously make a really nice podcast just with one voice, but personally I really like interviews and conversations, or a variety of different voices, even if you just have like little snippets of different voices from different people, which works really well. And I think that Vocaroo idea with the Google form. So once you've planned out the podcast, what you want it to be, and you're consistent, and the students know when you're going to be publishing. So consistency is really important. So they know that every Monday, the first Monday of each month, there's going to be a new episode, for example. Then they're ready and they're waiting to download the latest episode.
And I think we have time just for another question. Not really, but
that's fine. You can ask me as many questions as you want to. I'm really passionate about podcasting, so that's all good.
I'm very excited. So I would like this masterclass to be longer. So another question is it better to have a generic podcast or to niche down? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So what people tend to talk about in relation to this question is niche is better, because if your podcast is trying to cater to everyone's interests, then it's probably going to fall down. If it, like some podcasts, for example, could just be two people chatting about anything, any sort of subject, and unless they're really funny or they've just got a really nice rapport with each other, that probably isn't going to work. So having like a niche format, a niche topic that you talk about each time with the format is always the same, but the content is different, I would say it's the way to go. But again, ask the audience what potentially they would like, and think about carefully, you know, what you feel would have legs. If you want to do, like, I don't know, 100 episodes about stamp collecting, if you're really passionate about stamp collecting and you want to do a podcast about stamp collecting for your students, not to do with EFL, but just because you're passionate about it, if you feel that you have enough material to cover 100 episodes, then I would say go for it. It just depends on what you're interested in and what you want to talk about, really.